I'm Kelly Lewis,
And I'm Tiffany Jones,
and we are your revenue insiders. We have our first returning
first
guest.
returning guest.
Yay!
Yeah,
That just occurred to me.
yes. I'm so excited. Perfect for our first returning guest. Couldn't be
Yes.
more excited.
The wonderful Raheela, she did our Wicked episode when the first Wicked movie came out last year, and it was a fun one. So excited to have you back.
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be here. And I didn't realize that I was your first returning guest. So thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, no,
Absolutely.
so exciting. One of the things that Kelly and I have spent some time talking about recently is around leadership styles and the different ways that we show up at work, that people we work with show up at work, positive ways, negative ways. And Rahila, you see so much of this. So I think this can be a fascinating conversation to just discuss and really dissect the different ways that people show up as leaders.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are a plethora of different ways. And exactly as you said, Tiffany, through conversations with people show up in different ways, not just within those moments, but through their careers. I'm sure that all three of us have changed the ways that we've shown up as leaders within our time as well. And you've got such an inordinate amount of different leadership styles and some are traditional, some are more progressive, some are purposeful, all the rest of it. And it's really hard to actually articulate what a person's specific leadership style is, A, because it evolves, and B, because it has to be fluid depending on the situation that you're dealing with as well.
Absolutely. Well, before we jump in, Raheela, can you give us a brief introduction of who you are and your expertise? For those of you who have not listened to the Wicked episode, Raheela is my personal executive coach. I've worked with you, I think, for 2 or 3 years at this point, but you do so much more than that. So if you could just give the audience a little bit of your background.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I am Raheela and my business is reconsulting. So my business has two different parts. One is the coaching side, which is where I have the pleasure of meeting Kelly. So I coach leaders from all over the world. I'm lucky enough to work every time zone and I meet the most incredible people. And essentially I get to walk alongside them to where they want to go. So it's a massive privilege. And then the other side of my business is a marketing practice. So I've been in business to business marketing, for 8 years now. So I've seen the evolution of marketing through that. And the two parts of my business actually complement each other really well because having the very commercial side of my business keeps me very current for the leaders that I work with as well. And it works together really, really well. So I have my commercial work, which of course brings me joy, but then I have my proper joy work, which is the coaching side of it. So that's what I do.
I love it.
Well, let's kick off the conversation on leadership styles. Rahila, we were just discussing a little bit ago around kind of this concept of feminine energy in leadership. That there's probably lots of ways that people use around that, but I'd love to hear kind of your definition of what that looks like.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, Tiffany. So from a feminine energy perspective, my definition of it is really the embodiment of what I'll consider to be more of the female traits. So whether it's empathy, whether it's intuition, whether it's creative embodiment. So the things that I'll consider to be more female, but they are not in any way linked just to females or males. They are 100% gender neutral. And we all have both our feminine energy and our masculine energy as well. But my definition of feminine energy is really the intuitive side, the creative side, the empathetic side. So that's how I define feminine energy.
I kind of like that you share that we both have, everyone has both.
Mm-hmm.
I think as I look back on my career, especially early in my career, I sat in a lot of rooms with men, just me and a lot of men. And when I did have another female executive in that room, I often found that they walked in with an energy that did not feel authentic to me, meaning I could not, as you know, very early in my career, looking at this very powerful executive woman, I wanted to be her, but not be her energy. And I knew that because it just felt so inauthentic to me. Like there's no way I could come into a room and be that person. And I knew that. And so it's something that I've had to grow into. And I'm curious if either of you have experienced this. Like over my career, I tested the waters on like leaning one way or the other to see where is more natural and where I land. And it took time.
And Kelly, with that example, what did you feel from her energy that did not feel authentic for you?
Um, well, I will also point out that this was like the early 2000s, and we definitely weren't a people first organization. Concepts of looking at the individual were not there. And so I think as a leader, she did an awesome job, an amazing job of coaching me through the numbers and the KPIs and how to think through the business. But when it happened to how do I work with people? How do I align? How do I make sure we have synergies? How do I make sure I get my point across without speaking over people? Things like that were completely outside of this leader's comfort zone. And it very quickly, I noticed that, and I got worried at one point actually, like, can I move up in the executive world if I want to be an empathetic people leader?
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing. I assume most of us have like all thought through that have gotten to like more executive positions is like, do I have to be a person that I'm not naturally? Because I think masculine energy tends to be what dominates a room, whoever it's coming from. Like in when I think about like where I'm at in my career and like the, maybe not as many people first like organizations that I kind of came from, like that's just that's all that was really allowed in the room was this like very firm masculine energy. And it often was women who played that role well that got room. And I've worked with those women before, and I don't know if it's inauthentic, but it feels like they're playing a role more than they are leaning in and being themselves. I guess authentic is the right word for that. But yeah, it comes across as playing a role. And I feel like what I have found is instead of like deciding, I think Kelly, you just described it as like deciding like between the two, like where you can fall. I had an executive coach, it wasn't Raheela, several years ago that talked a lot about toolkits. And you don't have to like, you don't pick one thing or another in these types of situations. You view them as part of your toolkit. And you always have a favorite tool in your toolkit that you go to, but you don't abandon the others because there's a time and a place for them. And I definitely lead with more of that empathetic, people led, like really getting to the root of like problem style energy versus like a more like, aggressive or, I mean, I'm blunt without being and direct without often being like mean or making people feel like they have no other option. They have to go do exactly what I said like that. I don't show up that way a lot, but I have to use that tool some of the time. It definitely has a place.
Yeah. Tiffany, Kelly, thank you both so much for sharing those examples. It's massively common. And Tiffany, to your point about the toolkit, it's not that different to leadership styles, right? So we have, as I said earlier, there's so many different types, and you may not be an autocratic leader by default, but you're going to have to step into those types of traits when you're perhaps going through a disciplinary procedure or something else. And it is really picking the right tool in for the right moment that we have to deal with as well. And Kelly, with your example, and Tiffany, yours as well, with regards to female leaders that have stepped more into what could be considered to be more masculine traits or masculine energy. I remember, I don't know if either of you are familiar with Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos and the whole.
Mhm.
100%. Yeah.
Right. So I really, when I read about her and I watched the documentaries and I watched everything else, and I saw her trying to embody Steve Jobs, the black polo neck, she lowered the tone of her voice. And even though this is still relatively recent, it shocked me that somebody would consciously go to that number of degrees to step into what could be perceived as being more masculine. And if you look at the traits that she was actually fighting with within herself, I am really curious, like, how was that experience for her where she was going against her authenticity, to your point, Kelly, and then ended up in, and it's not necessarily all to do with her energy, but ended up in quite an interesting and tricky situation at the end of all of it. So this is not new, but it's fascinating to see how female leaders make their choices. So you've got, the Elizabeth Holmes of the world, and then you've got the Michelle Obamas, and you've got the other leaders that are so beautifully and authentically aligned with their feminine energy and are leveraging it in ways that work for them. And it's just a very interesting, just very interesting examples of choices that all of us have to make depending on what we want to feel and what we want to achieve as well.
I'm curious, Rahila. And this might just be my perception, so you guys, both of you, challenge me on this, but I feel like there has been a shift in the last like 10 or 15 years where like being a more authentic woman in kind of like that side of your power of like empathy and awareness and people driven is a lot more accepted and respected, especially in like the tech spaces. I'm curious if you've seen that with your clients and if you have any observations of like what maybe is supporting that shift or where it's come from. Because I feel it. Like I'm not the only woman in the room anymore, and I'm certainly not the only one that approaches problems the way I do.
Yeah, absolutely. I've 100% seen that being far more accepted recently. When I think back to the early stages of my career, Kelly, they weren't different to the way that you described yours. And, very often the only female in the room. And, I chose to dress the way that I dressed and all the rest of it. And I do think that the generations that have followed my entrance to the workplace, I think that they are so aligned with their own authenticity that it's a non-negotiable for them in a way that I know that it never was, or maybe it was for me, but I never realized it was a non-negotiable for me. And I think that that's entered the workplace, and every generation that has followed that has also just been a bit more authentic. And I believe that's why there is more of an expectation that companies are empathetic. And if we look at COVID, for example, the world changed literally overnight, and we had to start embracing things that we never really thought that we would have to consider or face or anything else. And I believe, Tiffany, big contributing factors to what we're seeing are generational shifts and things like COVID that forced us to change very fast and also taught us that we could change really fast.
This has me like going back to something that happened. I want to say it was like about 3 years ago. I was in a workshop fireside chat. There were 4 executive enablement leaders on this panel. We were all asking questions. We opened questions up to the audience. And one person in the audience said, I'm looking at all of you, and you all came up here and you have wonderful feminine energy. She said it. She's like, you all are big smiles. You're talking about empathy. You're talking about having empathy for the sellers. You're talking about how you align with leaders and listen. And her feedback was, I can't do that. That's inauthentic to me. But when I look at people, especially in the area of specialty that I'm in, that is typically who are in those roles. And so I tend to side with more masculine and men role models, but I would also like the ability to lean into that feminine side with still feeling authentic. And it was such a genuine question. It totally caught me off guard. And I have been thinking about it in the reverse for so long that I hadn't thought about it in that way of like, that actually maybe also feels inauthentic to some women. If you were her or you were me in that situation, what would you have said to her? Because I don't know that I gave her the proper answer.
Empathy is one of the very few skills that can be learned. And it's surprising. So if you look at things like emotional intelligence tests and things like that, if you do an EQI, for example, and you score less high on the empathy grid, you can change that. And with empathy being seen as more of an actually it's a necessary leadership skill now, we're going to have, if it doesn't feel authentic to you, and it's not the first time, Kelly, I've heard those types of situations, as you can imagine, it comes up in conversations, not massively frequently, but it's definitely not unusual either. It's somewhere in the middle. So you can learn the art of being empathetic is really to put yourself in somebody else's shoes or to understand how somebody else is feeling. And you can do that through creative questioning. You can do that by actively listening. You can do that in a number of different ways, which very slowly builds up the skill for you. So it's not necessarily an overnight revelation that comes through as a brand new skill. And it's definitely not something that ChatGPT can inject into you, but it is something that you can work on very intentionally and work on it with the people around you as well. So try being more empathetic at home. And some people, it's just not something that they're born with, which is totally understandable. But everybody, should they wish to, if they're intentional with it, should they wish to become more empathetic, it's 100% open to them. What did you say? Sorry, go ahead, Tiffany.
Go answer, Kelly. Sorry.
So I didn't lean into the empathy side as much, but I really like that you did. I led more with the directness. So again, you weren't in the room, so you didn't see her, but she was very direct individual, and you could tell she doesn't cushion her conversations. And so I led with a always be authentic first. But part of leadership and growing as a leader is understanding how others receive the information. And so we talked about the need to potentially soften some things you say. And I asked her to like, if I'm not who you can be, can you think of more masculine energy individuals who do this well? Great thing. There was one in the room who was able to have that conversation. But I think she just needed the comfort to know that she can still be her authentic self and just has to work on certain skills, and it doesn't have to feel like a drastic change for her.
I was going to say, I love, Raheela, the like concept of empathy as a learned skill, because I do feel like a lot of people just take it as like you are that person or you're not. And when I think about like, people I've coached, like they've worked for me like through career journeys, like managers are normally like fantastic ICs. Like they did really well at their job and now they're in a manager role. And someone in a middle management level is really great at decision making. Like this is a skill that they've learned how to do, call it prioritization, decision making. And then like senior leaders have to be great at empathy, or like they are not great senior leaders. You can't move someone that's just great at decision making up very far and not lose some people along the way or have some issues in their organization. And I think a lot of times, like skills like decision making or prioritization, people get pigeonholed and like that's not your brand or what you're good at. And so you're not eligible for this role. And Kelly and I had talked about strategy a few episodes ago, many episodes ago now. Like it's this like cop out word that people use to like say like you're not strategic enough, so you don't do this well enough. And I feel like some of it is like into that. I think we talked a lot about decision making, but I feel like a lot of it people use that word almost in place of trying to describe empathy or that feminine energy that they're missing, that senior leaders often require to I coax people into like coming along on the decision you're making or hearing them and responding the way that they want to be heard. It's not all just like, tears in a one-on-one or hugs or like, maybe I do those things too sometimes, but I feel like there's so much more breadth to that type of like emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it really does feel like there's pressure for leaders to be more empathetic because exactly to your point, Tiffany, it's such a buzzword that is mentioned so frequently now. And there's an article, I think it was like from April last year, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review saying that empathy is a non-negotiable leadership skill.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine the pressure that people are feeling to be more empathetic when that may not be their natural default, exactly with the examples that we've already talked about. The good thing about that article, and I don't know if it's I'll send it to you guys, and if it can go in the link, that would be great. And actually talks about ways that leaders can become more empathetic and lean more into those skills, because like we talked about earlier, it is available to everyone. It's just to the degree to which you want to participate in being more empathetic.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about empathy. The thing that always surprises me is how feminine energy can really support really stressful, high pressure conversations and almost diffuse those situations for a better outcome. And I think this is for everyone listening. What is the best way to approach that? Or do you have examples? Tiffany, I don't know if you want to start, if you have an example of maybe where you've seen or yourself have used your feminine energy to get a better outcome in a stressful situation.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably going back to toolkits, like the strongest tool that I use on a regular basis in any room, like from the executive meetings that I'm in to like individual one-on-ones. And I feel like I lean into it by really actively listening and understanding where the other person is coming from so that I'm not just blatantly challenging them and come across as someone who's like an adversary in the decision they're trying to make or the point they're trying to make, but instead am able to pose it as like, you said this, I think what you really want is this outcome. Have we considered we could get there doing X instead? And I think that the results would be better. And an example, we were chatting this morning about how to answer a question that was coming up in like a broad company channel. And the first response was like, the answer the person gave was, and the exec team was very like adversarial. It was like, no, that's wrong because of all of these reasons. I was like, I think that what you're trying to say makes total sense. That's really aligned with the direction we're going and what we want. But instead of telling them that they're wrong off the bat, maybe we can say, like, I hear that you're concerned. Here's where I'm coming from and why I see it differently, or why I don't share that concern. And I think that creates a better outcome for the people we were answering the question for, and the overall like mood. And so I do think it's a tool that I use on an extremely regular basis to help navigate those trickier decisions, or to get to outcomes that I want. Raheela, you have so many, like between your experience and client experiences, I'm sure you've seen examples where it's powerful as well.
Absolutely. And Tiffany, just to comment on what you shared as well, you're really building it into a great muscle. And that's half the battle, is really exactly to your point about toolkits. Just use them until they become so natural and integrated in your brand that they just feel really authentic, and then you instinctively know which tool to pick in which moment. This is a really great question, and yeah, I do have a few examples that spring to mind very quickly. Active listening is one point. I've also found that creative questioning so very much in a face-to-face scenario, not where a tone could be misinterpreted, so not via text, not via email, but really asking, why does this matter to you? But ask it in such a way that it's from a place of empathy. And I found, like, when I'm working with clients, particularly in an agency scenario, and when they are the business owners, and it's their brand is to their heart, like my brand is to my heart, where it's like, okay, help me to understand why this particular piece is such a non-negotiable for you, and why you're fighting so hard for it. And it feels like with those types of questions, because you're showing support by the type of question that you're asking, and you're also showing understanding, and then stop talking and allow them the space to step forward in that. So I think the creative questioning and the space for silence, they're two really big tools. And also, and I had a conversation about this recently with a client, where she really leaned into her instinct with a potential, what could have been a disciplinary situation within her workplace. And her instinct was telling her to not do anything, to actually hear both sides of a story. And she's a young leader, and she 100% did that. And then found out through conversation with her colleague that there were two very different sides to the exact same situation. So she did an outstanding job of leaning into her instinct. And and I was so happy, like, she was really proud of herself in that, and she should be, because it's not easy to be the one saying to leaders that she didn't want to do what they were suggesting that she did, and she stood her own. And it was really amazing to see. So I would say those are the main pieces that I've seen and I would lean into.
That's such a good point. I think oftentimes you hear people correlate performance management and not having empathy. And I think that's a great example of still being willing to do the performance management where needed, but using empathy to make the right decision. So I love that.
Yeah. I love a Brene Brown clear as kind quote. Like,
Oh, yes.
I don't know how many times I've given that advice in my career to like my leaders of people, to say, like, you do not have to be mean when you give feedback. Like, that does not have to, like, just because that's your only experience, or the vast majority of your experience, doesn't mean that that is the way it has to be delivered. Like, you can do it because you genuinely want the person to improve and not have that negative impact. And I do think it's such a clear, performance management is such a great example of, like, you can lean in either direction on kind of like that spectrum of feminine to masculine energy.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up Brene Brown, because if there's anyone that is really great at harnessing her feminine energy in the best possible ways, she's a great example of how to do it in the best possible ways.
Tool that I have in my toolkit, Tiffany, that reminded me a little bit of your story, so I'm going to throw it out here, is if you've ever heard of I wonder.
Mm-mm.
So at one of my previous companies, we were going through a few layoffs. It was tense. Meetings with the exec team were hard. We all were fighting for our people. We were fighting for our KPIs and our goals and what we thought was right in every conversation. It was difficult. And we actually had a third party come in and they taught us the phrase, I like, I wonder. And it was something we all started using, and it was magical in a way that everyone, despite what energy they were bringing into the meeting, which was not great energy, to be clear, we would pause and say, I like this about your idea. I like this about what you said, but I wonder if we looked at it this way. And because you were pausing, you were acknowledging that there were things about what was being said that you liked, just leveled out the room in a way that allowed the conversation to carry. And it was phenomenal. The entire exec team was using it really regularly. And we'd almost like joke about it because we knew we were using it on each other, but it really helped. So if you're looking for a tool in your toolkit, that's like one I absolutely love.
I wonder. I mean, it's the same thing, Raheela, you said, like, you're just building the muscle of empathy, of saying, like, I hear you. Like, I acknowledge that I heard what you said, and people just want to be heard. And once you break that down and create some trust, you can have an open dialogue and come to a different answer. Or you also have to be open too in that situation. Like, I think you can't use it think of the tool in your toolkit as a controlling factor that you have. Like, you have to come into it with the same open perspective. And when someone isn't reciprocating back that I wonder framework, you have to pause and say, did you hear can we take a step back? Do you acknowledge like what I just said? Can you hear that? Did you understand it? You just get so much more done when you approach things that way, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. I love the I wonder. I think that's a great tool, and I may well borrow that and share it with clients. So thank you, Kelly. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah. It's going to be like 3 weeks from now, Raheela, and you are in a coaching. She's like, I have this new framework.
Exactly right.
Totally. I think this is a I wonder situation. It'll be great. So, Raheela, I have another question for you. As an enablement professional, I'm always thinking about behavior change. We talked about empathy earlier. We've talked about other skills that you can gain as you want to become a bigger and better and different type of leader. How do you encourage your clients to experiment with some of these? I think that's always the hardest part, is doing it once. And oftentimes you need a safer space to do that. How do you kind of coach your clients to try some different behaviors?
The safe space is critical to it. So I would say that probably it's a combination of approaches. I'm a real advocate for the atomic habits approach, so a 1% shift. So getting people to be more comfortable with, so for anyone that's not familiar with it, so essentially it's like, what does a 1% change look like? So it could be, okay, I'm going to initiate a conversation with somebody around whatever it may be. It could be, I'm going to message them. There are varying degrees depending on the situation, but I would very much take the atomic habits approach within a safe space. And again, what we've mentioned earlier, just build up the muscle very, very slowly, because they're not going to be overnight changes. It has to be something that is grown slowly and organically so that we can grow alongside it. Because if you rush into it too fast, A, it's not going to feel authentic. B, you may not get the result that you're looking for. C, you may lose psychological safety. And then it just could potentially progress from there. So I would be extremely, I'd be extremely mindful about how you want to try to use it, and be very intentional. Think about the outcome that you want from every conversation. So go in knowing that this is the desired outcome that's going to work best for you. And then very slowly, not necessarily in one conversation, just build up to where it is that you want to be. And all the way along, just really reflecting on what you're receiving back. So that's probably where I'd start with it.
I think super interesting. The 1% I think is really hard for people to grasp, like what that
Mhm.
change really looks like. And I think what can be interesting when you frame it in such a small change, and this is, certainly my opinion. So Raheela and Kelly, you guys can disagree with me on this, but so much of this is like, we're talking about work right now, but this is so true in your general life as well. Like I don't know how many leaders I've worked with where like they've scored really low on an EQ, and then they do like marriage counseling, and all of a sudden their EQI at work goes like way up, and they show up as different leaders, or vice versa, right? They start working on it at work, and or they become a parent. Like, I do think being a parent forces more of this empathy on you and makes it a more natural state of mind to operate in. And so I think you see moms and dads show up this way to work more often because they maybe don't have the energy to context switch out of the parent mode. And having children often makes you have to parent a toddler. You put yourself in like that same empathy situation a lot more frequently. So I really like the atomic habits concept because you can apply it so broadly to help working on the scale without being like, people get scared of like, if I change this one thing at work, how is it going to go? Like, how are people going to perceive me, or will it work or not work? But I think the 1% can happen anywhere in your life.
Absolutely.
One other quick topic before we close out is I'd love to chat about is boundaries.
Mm.
So oftentimes I find that there's a correlation between feminine energy and not having boundaries. And I oftentimes also hear from male counterparts as we're having these conversations like, hey, I need you to soften that a little bit. And they're like, I'm not a pushover. That's the word they use back. And I would like to disperse that rumor right now that you can still have feminine energy and still hold boundaries. I think, Tiffany, this is something you and I work on all the time. But Raheela, I'd love to hear from you on how you coach your clients through that.
Yeah. And it's a tough one because feminine energy can be perceived as being less strong than masculine energy. And it's absolutely not. It's the energy of creation. And I don't know how much stronger you get than that. And it is hard. It's hard to have your boundaries, but being in your feminine energy absolutely does not mean that you're a pushover. And I do think that you lean into it more as you progress through life and progress through the decades, essentially. But if I'm coaching people through feeling like they are being perceived as pushovers, boundaries is a very, very common topic that comes up. And again, instinctively, you know when you are being pushed around, when you're being taken advantage of, and those pieces, and you have choices whether you want to do something about that or whether you don't. And if you don't, that's a whole different conversation. And if you do, it's like, okay, so again, we could bring in the atomic habits principle of, okay, what does a 1% shift to in your favor look like? But in addition to that, it's really trying to understand where is that person coming from and what are they trying to achieve? So I feel that if you're finding that your boundaries are being consistently pushed by a particular individual or a particular situation, it may be a really clear indicator that you need to go back to the drawing board with them and say, look, this is like, there's something about this approach that's not aligning for me right now. How can we look at this differently? Because I'm trying to get to X, you're trying to get to Y, but essentially our outcome for the company, for example, is the same. So how do we work on this collaboratively? And I would actually invite them to work in a collaborative way, or encourage my clients to get whoever it is that they're facing a situation with to try that as probably a first approach.
Yeah. I think, Kel, I deal with that comment all the time as well. Like, people don't like the word soften. It feels like icky sometimes for whatever reason. And I did a negotiation class once at Berkeley through like this Women in Berkeley program that I got to do through DocuSign. It was really fascinating. But this negotiation class helped frame that as, instead of like softening it, like, you need to negotiate. Like, you can't come in and it's not going to work. Being authoritarian doesn't work here. You're going to lose players along the way, and you're going to lose buy-in, and things are going to get deprioritized behind your back. So let's figure out how you set up everyone you go give this to be bought in. It's a manipulation, feels like a negative connotation, but like, you're politicking. It's why people don't like some levels of corporate, because you're playing politics. You're getting people to see your side. And I do think people have this like negative reaction to softening, or like a softer approach, a softer feminine energy, when in reality, like most good negotiators, like that's exactly what they're doing all the time, 24/7. Raheela, I would love, this is the point in our episode, and this is not a traditional episode since you are our first time second guest that we've had, but I'd still love for you to leave us with a point of view question for us to take away, and kind of this concept of different styles of leadership.
Thank you for that, Tiffany. I think the point of view or the question style I would probably leave your listeners with is, what's one way that they can lean into their instinct more? And that goes for both of you as well.
Always.
Love a homework assignment.
Love it.
Thank you, Raheela. This was great. I always love a good conversation with you. I'm sure everyone does as well.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be back, and so great to see both of you.
If anyone wants to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
My email address would be great. So it's Raheela@re-consulting.com.
Perfect. Amazing. Thank you both. Thanks, Raheela.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much. Bye.